Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton. This is mini lecture number 1, Genesis chapters 2 to 3. Now this material in Genesis stems from what we call the J source, which, as you know from watching our video on the documentary hypothesis, means that it stems from the 10th century BCE. It also means that this material has a folkloric nature, portrays God in an anthropomorphic fashion, and serves a mythic function. That is to say, the material in these chapters isn't historical in the sense that we now understand that term. Rather, this material serves a mythic purpose in that it attempts to explain the origin of humanity and why our world is in such a sorry shape. Our approach to Genesis 2 to 3, then, will be a literary one. That is, we'll approach these chapters as we would approach any other piece of literature, by paying attention to what we know of the time of composition, and by paying special attention to the language, imagery, and themes that are addressed in the text. Along the way, I'll pose several questions for thought for you, and it would behoove you to try and answer these questions on your own before contributing to our discussion board on these chapters. One of the challenges in these questions is trying to find reliable resources with which one can address the questions I pose. Oftentimes, a simple internet search won't be sufficient. Some of these questions will require more research and more engagement from you. In what follows, I simply want to point out some of the more interesting literary features in Genesis 2 to 3. And I'm assuming that you've read both Genesis 2 to 3 and all the other assigned secondary literature. Because of this, my purpose isn't to give an all-inclusive overview of Genesis 2 to 3. Rather, I'm simply going to note several key features of the narrative, especially features that aren't immediately apparent to people who can't read biblical Hebrew. One of the most obvious literary features of Genesis 2 to 3 is the wordplay which is evident in Hebrew. For example, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we hear of the creation of the first human. Note here that the Lord God forms this creature, quote, from the dust of the ground, end quote, and, quote unquote, breathed into this creature's, quote, nostrils the breath of life, end quote. This is clearly an anthropomorphic image of God, in that God's portrayed as carrying out human activities like forming and breathing. All of this is apparent from the text, but what might not be so apparent is the wordplay between the word the English translation renders as, quote unquote, man, and the word, quote unquote, ground. In Hebrew, these two words are obviously connected. That is, God creates Adam, that is the human, from Adamah, the earth or ground. Based on this wordplay, it seems clear that the author wants to establish a close relationship between the first human creature and the earth from which it was formed. I use the term it here deliberately because as of yet in the narrative, this human creature doesn't demonstrate sexual differentiation. That is, it's not a man, it's not a woman. That sexual differentiation is only introduced in the narrative after the creation of woman in chapter 2, verse 22. And not long after this first human is created in verse 7, this creature receives a vocational calling in chapter 2, verse 15, namely, to till and to keep the Garden of Eden. As such, the close relationship between this human creature and the earth is elaborated upon, and a new element is introduced. Not only is this creature tied to the earth, but this creature is also expected to be active in the upkeeping and the ongoing maintenance of this earth. And here's the first question I want you to think about. In chapter 2, verses 16 to 17, God speaks to the human for the first time and commands the human not to eat from a particular tree in the garden, one of two primary trees we hear about in this chapter. God tells the human that if the human eats of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that they'll die. And my question is, will the human die? Put differently, the human does eat of this tree and clearly doesn't die. So why is that? What does that say about God's omniscience and omnipotence? God clearly has concern for the human's solitary nature. In chapter 2, verse 18, God makes the choice to create a, quote, helper corresponding to him, or differently, quote, a helper as his partner. The term used here translated as helper in Hebrew is etzer, and it's used most often in the Bible to refer to God. Now, even though the human names all of the animals, and as such exercises a measure of control over them, and as was thought to be the case in the ancient Near East, chapter 2, verse 20 tells us that no fitting helper was found for the human. God then takes one of the human's ribs and, quote unquote, builds a woman, then brings her to the man. Now, this is the only independent story of creation of woman in ancient Near Eastern literature. And as such, we can say that she represents the pinnacle of God's creation in the J story. The human male speaks for the first time in chapter 2, verse 23, and his speech reflects a joy at the end of his solitude. You should take a minute, go to YouTube, and listen to the classic Etta James song, At Last. This song, maybe more than any other, demonstrates what the first human must have felt when he first beheld the woman. Again, we have a subtle wordplay here, as the woman, or the Isha, is created from the Ish, or the man. And here's your second question for thought. Is the woman inferior or subordinate to the man because of how she was created? Why or why not? The story clearly wants to connect chapters 2 to 3, as the word used to describe the nakedness of the male and female, aramim, is grammatically connected to the word crafty, or arum, which is used to describe a serpent in chapter 3, verse 1. The folkloric nature of this story from the J source is nowhere more apparent than in the fact that beginning in chapter 3, the serpent and the woman engage in a conversation. Now, we're unsure as to why the serpent approaches the woman instead of the man, but we are sure that this is the first human dialogue, as well as the first human mention of God. So here's my third question for you. Does the serpent's question in chapter 3, verse 1 allow for an easy answer? That is the woman able to answer this question with a simple yes or no? If not, then perhaps the serpent approaches the woman in order to engage her in dialogue. Note also that the woman's answer in chapter 3, verse 2 actually represents a misquotation of what God told the first human back in chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. Now, why would the woman tell the serpent something different than what God told the first human? The serpent responds to this misquotation by contradicting God's claim in chapter 2, verse 17, and telling the woman essentially that by eating the fruit from the tree, that she and the man will be like gods, that is, able to discriminate between good and evil. Now, beginning in chapter 3, verse 6, the woman engages the tree in three very different ways. First, she sees that the tree's good for food, so she's engaging the tree at the level of survival. Second, she sees that it's a delight to the eyes. That is, she engages the tree at the level of aesthetic beauty. And third, she sees that, quote, the tree was to be desired to make one wise, end quote. So she engages the tree at the level of pragmatic utility. That is, she wants to be wise. In chapter 3, verse 6, we're told in a series of short staccato Hebrew verbs that she took, she ate, she gave, and he ate. Now let's look at this verse in a little bit more detail. My fourth question to you is, where was the man during the conversation between the woman and the serpent? Now, how you answer this question depends on how you understand the Hebrew word imah, which means with her. The problem with how you understand this word is that it can be understood in two very different ways. On the one hand, you can understand it as the woman also gave some to her husband who was with her, that is, who had been with her this whole time, and as such could have stopped the woman from eating the fruit if he so desired. On the other hand, you could understand it as She also gave some to her husband, and he ate along with her. This latter understanding implies that the husband was only with her during the eating, and as such wouldn't have been able to intervene during the conversation between the woman and the serpent. However you understand that particular Hebrew word, it seems clear that in chapter 3, verse 7, the male and the female gain a new level of understanding, as we're told that, quote, the eyes of both were opened, and they knew they were naked. At this point, they make clothes for themselves because, in the world of the story, being naked as a human is, for some reason, unacceptable. Beginning in chapter 3, verse 8, God re-enters the story, and again we see his anthropomorphic nature as we're told he's strolling through the garden. Over the next few verses, we see the humans play what we could call the blame game, as God first asks the man, "What have you done?" Then the man blames the woman, and the woman, in turn, blames the serpent. In verses 14 through 19, God speaks to the three characters in the inverse order to the blame game. That is, God first addresses the serpent, then the woman, then the man. In these verses, God issues two curses, one for the serpent, one for the earth, and then makes a pronouncement to the woman. Implicit in these curses and pronouncements is a rupture in the ideal creational realm of existence, as well as the relationships, that is, human to human, human to animal, human to earth, and human to God, that have been fostered therein. God addresses the serpent in verses 14 to 15 and specifically uses curse language to describe the impact or the result of the serpent's actions. In verse 16, God doesn't curse the woman. This is a key point for us. Rather, God makes a pronouncement about her pangs, the same word used to describe what the man will endure in chapter 3, verse 17. Now, I've often marveled at the negative view many interpreters have of the pain of childbirth described in verse 16, seeing as how the woman has no frame of reference to understand what God's talking about here. After all, we haven't been told that she's ever experienced either pain or childbirth. And as such, this pronouncement might not seem so threatening to the woman in the story. Imagine the woman and the man standing together listening to God, and the woman leans over to the man and says, "Hey, do you know what this pain thing is?" "No, I have no idea." "Well, what about birthing? I don't know what that is, but it doesn't sound like I'm going to enjoy it." In God's pronouncement to the man, in verses 17 to 19, there is certainly curse language used, but it's not directed at the man. Rather, it's directed at the ground. In effect, what God says in chapter 3, verses 14 to 19, is that the relationships that have been established between the human and the earth, the human and the animal, and the human with other humans are all now thrown out of balance. As such, when we hear in verse 20 that the man names his wife like he named the animals earlier, we're not surprised to see this display of dominance on the part of man over woman, because their relationship, which previously had been based on equivalence, has now been ruptured. And this feeds into my fifth question. What do you think is implied in God's speech in verses 14 to 19 regarding the relationships established in these chapters? What consequences will we see of this rupture in coming chapters? It also leads to another interesting question, namely, why does God clothe the man and the woman in skins in chapter 3, verse 21? What ethical implications might be present in such an act? Finally, in chapter 3, verses 22 to 24, we hear about the expulsion of the humans from the garden. As many scholars have noted, God in 3:22 seems to be engaging in dialogue with non-humans, and his dialogue partners seem also to be somewhat divine, as they are described as being, quote, like one of us, knowing good and evil. So, here's my final question to you. Who's God speaking to here? Most scholars think that God's speaking here to God's divine court, a group of beings made up of semi-divine creatures. After all, one sees in later biblical literature the presence of angels, as well as figures like the divine adversary or the Satan in the book of Job. As such, God may not be alone in the story. What repercussions might that have for the monotheistic view of God in the Old Testament? Well, I hope you found these remarks helpful, and I look forward to hearing your answers to the questions I've posed, as well as your other comments on Genesis 2 to 3.